next year. If you'll flip us to the next slide. So picture pause. This is one of the ads that we have running at Garfield High School. The student, she was a Garfield High School graduate and then came to Central as a Seattle Promise student. So we'll soon have posters like this for all 3 of the colleges so that the high school students can see a face that they know and recognize and that has been successful as a Seattle Promise student as well. And then if you flip this. So past fall 2019, which is when we'll be doing outreach into all of the high schools, we'll be expanding those Readiness Academy and Summer Bridge programs because we're expecting lots more students now that we're going from 6 high schools to 17. And by fall of 2020, that's go quarter. So fall of 2020 is when any high school graduate from a Seattle Public High School can attend any Seattle college as a Promise student. So that's our big, huge launch quarter. So last thing is how do students get started? So if you know a student for this year at Ingram who might be interested in the program, Kelsey is the contact person, and Kelsey has regular office hours at Ingram High School. She also is stationed here at North in the Student Success Services area, so they can contact Kelsey. Also, I would encourage folks to visit our website if they have questions, so seattlepromise.seattlecolleges.edu. And then on my next slide, so another FAQ that I have been getting at other colleges from faculty is, what would be useful for me to know about these students? Because it is a little bit of a demographic shift from the typical students that we are used to maybe serving. So man, yellow and white is hard to see. These are hyperlinks, so I can send links to you if you want more information. So some general FAQs about Gen Z students, which that's the population that's coming in for Seattle Promise. Things I thought were interesting, they were never taught to read or write cursive. And so some of the feedback we're getting from students is like, I'm doing my best on my papers, but I get the feedback on my papers is in cursive, and they can't read it because they were never taught to read or write cursive. So something to know. Some other things, this is generalizations about this group, but they're pretty entrepreneurial. A lot of them are already working, even in high school, before they come to us. They're more financially driven than millennials were, and they're more practical than millennials were. So millennials maybe they have their head in the stars, guilty. But I think we're seeing with Gen Z that they're a little bit more practical. And some of that comes from being really young when the recession happened and seeing how their parents had to navigate the world when times were really hard. They are really tech savvy, so everyone take a moment and think about your first smartphone that you got. Just remember that moment, how much money it cost. It's probably really expensive, felt like an arm and a leg. They don't have those memories because they have always had smartphones in their lives, always. So they expect to be using technology when they're interacting with us as a college, when they're interacting in the classroom. This is just a part of their lives. They've grown up in the elementary and middle school and high school systems with technology being an integrated part of their learning experience. So they expect that here as well. So some interesting things about Gen Z. I'm going to stop talking. If you have other questions, so on the next slide, my information is there. You can reach out to me. Kelsey, if you'll raise your hand. She's the Student Success Specialist here at North. You can also reach out to Kelsey or Joe or Dr. Bottleman if you have questions. Does anyone have any questions right now that we can answer? Yeah?
Are there any plans to cover students who are in programs who are over 90 credits?
It's something that we are talking about with the city and with the design team that we're working with the city and SPS.
It's a bit of a function of the amount of funding, so we're building into the initial agreements and the documentation that if there is funding available, it's something that we can consider going forward. There's other populations as well that currently are not eligible for the Promise program, but we're making sure that if there's opportunity, we'll build that in.
Bruce?
It's not really a question, but don't forget the students who get their high school diplomas at North and want to continue. I would like them to be part of this program too, and I think they're well suited to continue since they already go to school here. I don't want to forget about
saw a question up here.
If the student isn't ready to meet that first deadline of registering in their senior year, in February, I think it was, do they lose their opportunity to participate in this, or can they take a gap year, or?
And so right now, the deadlines are pretty strict, and we are trying our best to adhere to them in a pretty strict way. If a student has an extenuating circumstance, then they can work with the student success specialist at their campus, so they can work with Kelsey to see if there is any leeway that we have with them, but they really need to be meeting those deadlines in order to maintain their eligibility for the program.
So, one of the things I've heard discussed in some other communities that are implementing this is that they're realizing that while they're providing financial support and a framework like guiding them through, that there are lots of other missing pieces relating to living costs, and we know in Seattle here that that's quite high, and now they're maintaining this full-time status. So do we have a plan in place for aiding and assisting in these other ways?
One of the things that I think is really exciting about the Seattle Promise partnership that we have with the city is we're in the process of finalizing an equity scholarship for students in the program, and so that equity scholarship would be an additional $1,000 for students who are our lowest income students in the program, and that money is designed to be used towards things like transportation, housing, childcare, books, food, whatever they may need to use that funding for on a quarterly basis. So excited to get that rolling soon.
So I had a question about placement, when that placement, how that placement will be done, can be the testing or just off the transcripts. And then I noticed you only had one readiness day and 2 bridge days. But what about those students who aren't college level math or language arts ready? Is there going to be something to bridge them to the college level program?
Sure, so for first part of your question with placement, we are working with students and looking at the multiple measures that are placement options at each college to find what is the most advantageous placement for the student that they're eligible for. So for some of them, placing them, for example, into an English class based off of their Seattle Public High School GPA is what makes the most sense. For some of them, using their SBAC scores, or maybe if they've taken the SAT or ACT, we can use that. For some students, it makes sense to have them come in and take the Wonderlic and take the placement test here on campus. So we're working with students on an individual basis to help them navigate what's the best option for them as an individual. And then in terms of the dates, so Readiness Academy is a much shorter program. Really the end goal of the program is to get them registered into classes. So we're helping them to navigate all of those placement mechanisms up until Readiness Academy, and then when they come to Readiness Academy, that they would already know where they've been placed into. So it's a much shorter program, which is why it really is only half a day on May 15th. And then Summer Bridge is a more intensive program. So Summer Bridge is actually both days, where students would come to campus for both days, and they do a tour, and they get to meet DeAndre, and I saw him somewhere, there he is. They get to be introduced to student leadership. They talk to Jamie about what the expectations are in the classroom, learn what a syllabus is. So it's a much more intensive program that is a 2-day program. Did that answer your question?
No.
Good.
Sorry, I mean, I'm talking about readiness for college. For example, I'm a math teacher, readiness for college level math. For those who aren't in March when they, do the placement and figure all of that out, is there something to help bridge them to college level math so they don't have to start in our developmental math program?
I think that's where we need to be partnering with Seattle Pathways to bridge these transformative programming options that we're implementing in Seattle colleges to make that happen. I think that's probably a little out of the scope for what Seattle Promise is doing, but it's something that we need to be working closely together as those pathways are ramped up.
Students who are placed in those pre-college math courses, that is part of their 90 credits in this program, so.
Yeah, I understand that's part of it, but if they can get a head start on getting to the college level courses, then.
Yeah, like all of our students, that's exactly what we're looking for, but there's nothing super unique about how this population will enter into that at this point. Does that answer?
Yeah, and I'll say a little bit
Differently?
about this just a bit.
Differently.
Okay.
So you're saying that the developmental courses would be part of the 90 credits? So if their degree was also 90 credits, but the developmental piece to get them to college ready, they would then be, 10 credits short of completing an associate degree?
Yes.
Okay, so 90 credits of tuition.
Or their first associate's degree. Yeah. It's not, it's, those of us who work here know that we're not just gonna say, 80 credits, sorry, we can't help anymore. There are lots of other financial aid options. We're trying to build in more flexibility for students like that, for the workforce program students. But at this point, the formal documentation on this program is the first 90 credits or the first 2 degrees. Yep.
Yeah, just a question in regards to for those students that may be participating in Running Start, how will that transition with this program? For, in particular, those Eagle Beavers is in school early and actually gaining college credits. How would that transition to pathways?
Sure, so.
Promise, excuse me.
So Running Start students are eligible for Seattle Promise as long as they meet the other criteria for the program. The program will cover up to 90 credits towards a student's first associate degree. So if a Running Start student comes in to us and they have already earned 60 credits towards their first AA maybe, and they want to continue on the AA pathway, then Promise would cover the remaining 30 credits for them. If they come in and maybe they've only done 1 quarter of Running Start, then Seattle Promise would cover the remaining 75 credits towards their that first associate degree. So it a little bit also goes into what credits is the student bringing in and are those being applied towards their first associate degree. But Running Start students are eligible for the program.
Paul?
Let's use the mic for the people, so people can hear.
So I've heard a lot about focus on equity, and in what you described, Mr. Buttleman, those who will end up coming up short with the support to get to that AA degree will be disproportionately students of color, immigrant students, first-generation college students. So I'd like us to have a focus on equity, but in what you're describing here, I think it's clear to me that what we have planned here isn't giving those who have less the extra so they can also achieve that goal of getting that AA degree.
Yeah, so Paul really could have stole my thunder on this because I think both the topics we talked about today really go together, right? And the whole thing about guided pathways is ensuring that equity focus. And I don't want to have the impression that North is kind of in it. We're committed to pathways because of that equity focus. What I had talked to DeAndre about is let's now use the promise as an opportunity to scale up those efforts with that equity focus. So DeAndre had already looked at all the data as far as the students of color, underrepresented students that are at Ingram through this pipeline, and beginning to develop those support processes for them. I think what Paul is talking about also is a guided pathways issue that I need your help with. I need all your help with. We know that there's higher percentage of students of color and underrepresented students that are in pre-college classes, right? And part of what guided pathways is all about is challenging institutions to stop that practice, because when you're stuck in there and you're more likely to be a student of color, a first generation student, underrepresented student, it's harder to get out. And then when you add something like Seattle Promise, then you're eating up your free tuition being in basic skills. So here's the point. One thing that the team talked about at the Guided Pathways Conference is the value of the funds we have available through the grant. And maybe the best way to do it is in the next step as we deal with guided pathways, Seattle pathways, is to have faculty and staff identify what are those barriers right now that we know we can fix. And I don't want to put words in Paul's mouth, but I think one of those is how can we ensure that students that are currently in high school, that by the time they take their math placement to get into the Seattle Promise or thereafter, how can we develop structures to support them so they're not wasting their precious time in developmental education classes? So I could say across the district, you know, we don't have that program. And I know we don't have that program in North. So I think the challenges for us is not just to talk about the numbers, is to do something about it. So part of the funds that are available with the Title III grant, we didn't say too much about this, but there's going to be a form for faculty or staff that have identified, here's a gap that we can address right now that is an equity focus that will actually enhance student success. Then the grant will provide funding for that. So the opportunity is, yes, we don't have that now, but gosh, we could really use math faculty's help, others' help, and fund it through the Title III grant to put in that math support. So that's where I want us to go with it. And that's what I think Kelly said beautifully. If the institution is putting intentional blocks in front of our students or unintentional blocks, we have a responsibility to fix that. The students can't fix that for us. And so already Paul's identified, I think, an opportunity for us to get it right. Now I will say this, looking at the numbers for the Seattle Promise, I am pleased that one reason that we decided to go with Ingram is their focus of equity in Ingram. We have a higher percentage of students of color coming through Ingram and the Seattle pathways than Native students at Ingram. So that's a good number, but we want to make sure that we're tracking their success as well. And we know that we've lost some just in next quarter, right? So we've already lost 10. Why did we lose 10? How can we get those 10 back? And how can we make sure we have the structures right so the next cohort won't lose 10 students along the way? So that's when I think we can all work together under the umbrella of the Seattle Pathways and funded work to really make a difference. So that's why I think these two topics are really one topic in itself. Any other questions?
I can just interject, Paul, the questions you're asking, or the mayor's asking these questions, city council's asking these questions too. How do we, the ordinance says X, how do we make sure things like you're describing are happening in this program? So it is not something that anybody thinks is intentional or here's how this is going to be. We're trying to figure out how with, in light of the ordinance and the levy, how to accommodate those types of things. So, yeah, people are interested in this in a big way.
So do we have an answer?
Not yet. Not yet.
And just to note, based on the Ingram data, and I was in Olympia testifying to this, the Seattle Promise itself, we know district-wide 56% of high school students said they weren't even thinking they were college material had it not been for the Promise. So this is a game changer for so many students that thought college is never for me. So it's not now just about access, right? Because access is funded. It's how can we support them to success? So we can't just say, well, we have this promise, but students failed. No, did we fail them? And so that's where I really would like to pivot that approach. But at the same time, I think it's exciting. It is really exciting that we're doing this work. But we can't just think this is an access issue. We've got to think about it as an equity and success issue. All right, get off my soapbox.
Sorry. Warren, so you mentioned we would have an opportunity to look at where we work. We've mentioned a couple of times. I guess, is that a next step? Like, are we going to be receiving some sort of way to communicate, oh, this is a barrier I've been running into, and I think we could possibly use Seattle Pathways as a way to fix this problem?
Yeah, I think,
Go ahead.
yeah, this all started, and then actually I want Amy to talk a little bit about the Title III part of this as well. I think that's the natural next step, because we, in the team, we realized that, again, the framework around guided pathways is an organizing principle. So we need to make sure that we're identifying what work we're doing well, and what are the gaps, where are we falling behind, right? And so through the process of shining a light on where we're falling behind this institution and challenging us to be better, that is what the Title III grant can cover, and Amy will talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But let me just give another example. Years ago, some of you might remember we had Rob Johnstone here, who was talking about guided pathways about 3 or 4 years ago. The first place he went was he brought up our website, and he asked us to think, if you're a student, how to navigate what classes you want, what program you want, and it was a mess. It was a mess. I mean, it's a little bit better now, because we now have some frameworks right there on the main page. But beyond that, it's like, if you're an undecided student, what does that website say to you? Or if you're a student, and the example he gave was psychology. If you want to major in psychology, how would you engage in classes here at North to get to that pipeline? That's not clear, right? So there's work for us to do to make things a lot clearer for our students, and then there's work we can do instructionally that can really help provide those supports to make sure students are not just churning their wheels in developmental classes. And if that's co-requisites, if it is mock placement testing to help them then guide towards that, if it's StatWay or QuantWay, which has been shown effective at Central. I think we need to kind of break out of that mentality that what we've been doing is good enough. And it's good enough for those students that were going to be successful anyway, right? It's good enough for students. If we throw more barriers in front of the students that are going to be successful anyway, they're going to find ways around it. But for other students, as soon as they see that first barrier, that's it, they're done. And so that's a challenge for us. So Amy, can you talk a little bit more? I know there's a form that Title III is putting together that says, if you find these gaps or barriers that tie with the Title III funding, here's what you do. So would you mind saying a little bit about that?
Yes, can I say something real quick? I appreciate, I just want to call out that moment, because we're saying equity a lot, and equity calls out things that are uncomfortable. And I appreciate Paul for making it uncomfortable, because we've been saying equity, 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 and we're using equity here and equity here. That is the uncomfortability, that the sense of belongingness that the students who we're trying to help feel when they enter this institution. So the fact that we as administrators and faculty cannot feel uncomfortable, that's problem number one. We need to feel uncomfortable. We need to be able to say, we don't have that problem, we don't have a solution yet. But today we're trying to call it out and recognize it. So I just want to say, having that uncomfortability right now is a plus. That means we're moving, and we need to be doing that. So I just wanted to just kind of call that out. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll talk about two things. So one thing we didn't talk too much about is the guiding team. So we're going to have that as part of this institution, where we have a lot of people from all different departments as a decision-making group to help us guide this work with guided pathways. So one of the big hopes with that group is to determine what those gaps are and how we want to move forward as an institution. So that's one thing. But in terms of having a form, we're already starting to work on that. So one of the great things about this grant is it does give us some money. There is very specific grant guidelines that we have to follow, but within some of them we have a little bit of flexibility. And so right now, one of the big things we're trying to determine is really how much money we have for some additional projects related to guided pathways and related to bridging those equity gaps and things like that. So that's a lot of the work that's happening right now. And so we hope to have a request form actually ready February 4th. So that's Monday.
So I'm gonna add to
Yeah,
it.
go for it.
So I'm gonna maybe put my foot in my mouth, so Ann or Amy, correct me if I'm wrong. Important to remember about Title III that the proposal was written more than 18 months ago. And while much of what was written is relevant, still, some of it we are in the process of tweaking. We're working with our external evaluator.
Well, in our Department of Education as well.
Thank you. We're working with the Department of Education. I told you I put my foot in my mouth. We're working with the Department of Education to reconfigure parts of the grant. And so a part of our learning and a part of Amy's early work has been, with Ann, has been to make the Title III grant relevant now. Not that to make some tweaks to it. And so I know that some of you have already reached out to Amy. 4 or 5 different groups have reached out with requests for funding. We're not ignoring those. We want to get 2 things set. First, one, we want to make sure that we've got all the check boxes checked correctly in terms of working with the Department of Ed about tweaking the grant. And 2, we want to have a process so that it's not just the first proposal that comes in gets funded. So tomorrow at 11, we're meeting to get that process, about the process started. And we hope to very quickly have form and process so that when barriers are identified, proposals can come in.
Questions?
Oh, I turned that off.
Yeah. Yeah, other questions or comments? For anybody, for the panel, for...
Seattle Promise. Question on Seattle Promise. So my understanding is that there is an opportunity for a gap year. Is that accurate? It's they have to apply senior year, February 15th deadline. Is that accurate?
Right, so students have to enroll as a Seattle Promise student at a Seattle college the fall quarter immediately following their high school graduation. So there's not an opportunity for a gap year.
So those students that didn't persist into winter quarter, those 10 that were referenced earlier, would they have an opportunity to come back under Seattle Promise?
So right now, there is not a process for students to re-enter into the Promise program, and it's something that we are really interested in moving that conversation forward with our partners at SPS and at the city. But right this minute, there's not a process for students to re-enter into the program.
One more, is there a minimum GPA requirement for Promise students?
There's not to get into the program. In order to maintain eligibility for the program, students have to be meeting satisfactory academic progress guidelines as established by our financial aid office. So students do need to be maintaining minimum levels.
And point out the
Use the mic.
Oh, thank you. Speak to the financial limitations of the family. There's no, say more than I'm stumbling.
Right, so students are eligible for Seattle Promise program as long as they graduate with a Seattle Public School diploma. And so for this year, that's students from any of those 6 partner high schools. Starting for graduates next year, class of 2020, any student who graduates with a Seattle Public High School diploma will be eligible, regardless of what their high school GPA was, regardless of what their test scores are, regardless of family income. Regardless of background or documentation status, if they have a diploma from a Seattle Public High School, they'll be eligible for the program.
Just a quick follow-up on that. So that's a place of discomfort for many. So there are other programs where Jeff Bezos' kid would not qualify for this program because Jeff Bezos has the funding to go to North Seattle Community College. So this program was built for every kid, regardless of your family's income. And so there is more of the funding probably going to go to kids' tuition from this program, who have more income than those that do not. The kids that do not have that income are getting their financial aid met first through Pell Grants and state need grants and other financial aid. So all students have full financial aid income met. It's just different. Some of this funding is going to be to kids that probably don't need it, and that's how the program is designed. And I don't know if Brian has any more to add to that. Brian was also a huge part of the implementation of this before any of us really knew what we were doing. So kudos to Brian for all her expertise on this. So is there anything that you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's an accurate summary of it unless there's, no, I think that's an accurate summary of how it works financially for the students, unless there's any specific questions I can answer.
So my question was, I've heard a lot of mention about students who finish a Seattle Public High School with a high school diploma. Is that the wording? So are there ways to finish high school at a Seattle Public School where you would get something other than a high school diploma and thus not qualify?
So my understanding is that there is a small population of students who could be issued some type of a credential from a Seattle Public High School that is not technically a diploma. It would be considered an alternative document that they're being issued. Those students would not be eligible for Seattle Promise program. My understanding right now is that those are primarily international students who are on a very specific visa type where they don't plan to stay and continue their education according to that visa type anyway. But those students would not be eligible. Students who are receiving a GED right now would not be eligible for the program, and so forth. Jesse?
So does the credit clock start ticking as soon as they enroll in the first class, even if they're getting financially met through Pell Grant? For instance, if a low-income student is getting Pell Grant for 90 credits, but not through funding through the Seattle Promise, do we have any flexibility to use it for anything after that 90 credits?
So regardless of what their funding mechanism is, as a Seattle Promise scholar, that 90 credit clock starts ticking their first quarter that they're enrolled with us.
It's a creative idea. Things like that. They are getting the support from the program, but I think the ordinance would say that ideas like that are good ones to serve us.
All right.
Do students have to be heading toward a two-year degree? Could they say, I don't know about that, I want to transfer and I want to get ready for that, but I don't think I wanted to, but maybe I can answer one question. Maybe they just start working and maybe where they end up is where they end up. But do you have any thoughts on that?
We tried to choose the broadest, highest level credential that a student might want to pursue. The reason that we're saying associate degree is so that if a student chooses maybe to pursue a program where there's stackable certificates, that the funding doesn't cut off for them after they've earned their 15 credit certificate, but they really intended all along to go through, for example, our electronics program. That students could do those stackable certificates up through 90 credits. So it covers 90 credits up to your first associate degree. Of course, if a student, after a year, they've met what their educational needs and goals were, and it's time for them to transfer and move on, then their student success specialist is going to help to support them in organizing their plans